right, well, when we study history, be it the history of religion or otherwise, it is helpful, I believe, sometimes to remind ourselves of the simple notion that things could have been differently. Right? People could have made different choices, and different outcomes could have resulted from those choices. And a different history could have evolved. Reminding ourselves of that will help us ask some questions and to think about events and developments that we might otherwise take for granted. One question that has, up to this point in my career, really informed some of the work that I do is the simple question of why the Sunni-Shia split? How is it that two distinct communities with arguably mutually exclusive religious perspectives emerged from a broader Islamic milieu that was characterized by complexity and diverse overlapping loyalties? Now, of course, any meaningful attempt to answer that question would take far longer than the time we have today, and would force us to grapple with assumptions inherent in the question itself, including the assertion that Sunni and Shia identities are mutually exclusive. By positing the question, I have no desire to assert that the two categories have to be, or that they ought to be, mutually exclusive. And of course, in this lecture, I'm referring primarily to Twelver Shiism. However, I don't think we can ignore that many Muslims historically and many people today have treated these two categories as mutually exclusive terms. So the question remains of how and why this view came to be predominant, and that lies at the background of some of the specific topics that I want to talk about today. I expect that you are all familiar with many of the key events in the 7th century on which Sunni and Shia perspectives diverge. These include, of course, disagreements over who had the right to lead the Muslim community after the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632. Abu Bakr, of course, effectively assumed the authoritative position as leader of the community and is recognized by Sunni Muslims as the first caliph. In contrast, Shia Muslims claim that the Prophet's nephew and son-in-law, Ali, was the rightful inheritor of the Prophet's authority, and that Abu Bakr was a usurper. 25 years later, after that, the Muslim community was embroiled in a civil war between some supporters of Ali and some who opposed him. Notable among his adversaries was the beloved wife of the Prophet and daughter of Abu Bakr, Aisha. Less than 50 years after the Prophet's death, in the year 680, tensions manifested themselves again when the Prophet's grandson, Hussein, was killed by Umayyad forces, along with many of his family members and supporters. This last event, of course, is annually commemorated by many Shia Muslims around the world. These events are the sectarian signposts of early Islamic history, and Sunni-Shia differences are often explained through the prism of these events. Why did Sunni and Shia Muslims part ways? A typical answer would point to these events, these conflicts, and say that's why, because of these events. My suggestion, however, is that these events themselves do not go very far toward explaining the emergence of distinct sectarian identities. There is little doubt that rival factions did exist in early Muslim communities, and that disaffected groups frequently rallied in support of one or another of the Prophet's family members or descendants. But I'm not convinced that the conflicts of the 7th and 8th centuries played a primary role in determining the course of sectarian history. Ultimately, identity was shaped not so much by the facts of those disputes, which in any case has been obscured by the passage of time, as they were by the narratives formed around those events. Thus, much of my study of Twelver Shi'i history has been an exploration of these narratives. How did Twelver Shi'i communities remember and articulate their past? How did they tell the stories that framed those early events, and why? This has been my primary concern, and it led me to a specific type of narrative, stories of the lives of the 12 imams. As I read through works by Shi'i authors from the classical period, I was captivated by a body of writings that I eventually have come to see as its own genre or subgenre. These are individual books recounting the biographies of all 12 of the imams. I spent the last few years examining some of these earliest works in that genre. Now, again, as you may recall, according to Twelver Shi'i doctrine, the Prophet's son-in-law and cousin Ali, who died in 661, was the first imam. He was succeeded by 11 of his descendants, the last of whom is said to have gone into a semi-permanent form of hiding beginning in 873, referred to as the ghaiba, the occultation. In subsequent decades, the community that was loyal to this particular line of men was forced to reconcile itself to his prolonged absence. And half a century later, at least by the mid-10th century, a distinctly Shi'i, Twelver Shi'i identity was beginning to coalesce. The biographies of the imams was instrumental in this development and this process, because the way that the imams' stories were told reflected and facilitated a change in the community's orientation. The imam's absence, the 12th imam's absence, tempered the revolutionary, dissident aspects of his followers, who gradually adopted more pragmatic social perspectives. The Shi'i community that formed in the 10th and 11th centuries had its intellectual locus in Baghdad, where many of its members worked to influence rather than to topple the existing socio-political order. This concern undergirds the works of many of the Shi'i intellectuals of the time who wrote in a variety of disciplines, including theology, law, and history. And if we are in search of the answers to the question of how Sunni and Shi'i forms of Islam developed into categories that most Muslims would go on to conceive as mutually exclusive from one another, I think we have to focus on this period in the 10th to 12th century, rather than the earliest period of Islamic history. And that's where my research has been centered. Now, as I said, the specific genre of literature that I find so interesting, they began to appear in the 10th century. These are works that are comprised of books that give successive accounts of the lives and the stories of all 12 imams in one book, thereby together forging a new meta-narrative of history as seen through Shi'i eyes. The stories contained in the biographies are fascinating and influential, and they operate as indirect but compelling commentary on diverse questions of authority, community, and human responsibility. This literature unfailingly portrays the 12 men as perfect, as infallible, as and the authors regularly describe them as things like attractive, as physically adept, as brilliant, as creative men. These imams were seen to be the best of men. Implicit then within these stories are assumptions about gender and sexuality, about masculinity and femininity. Indeed, through the biographer, although the biographers are primarily focused on these 12 male imams, the books contain stories about many women, often who appear at critical points in the narrative. And attention to where these women appear and why they appear there, I think will help us to analyze the goals that the authors had in writing these books. My talk today seeks to highlight a few of the gendered ways in which the biographers of the imams sought to convey a meaningful narrative for their growing community. Excuse me. So I will now turn to a story from the biographies. Variations of the story that I want to mention today and focus on today, they appear in a number of Shi'i sources, and elements of this story can be found in a few Sunni sources as well. The particular version that I've chosen comes from a work entitled I'lam al-Wara bi'A'lam al-Huda by the early 12th century Shi'i scholar at-Tabrizi, a scholar better known for his work of tafsir, Majma' al-Bayan. I'm going to read my translation of the account in full, but I should warn you that the story is likely to seem very strange. Indeed, many of the stories contained in the imams' biographies are at odds with modern sensibilities, but it is important to remember that our associations attached to certain images today often differ markedly from those who lived a millennial ago. Pre-modern hagiographies from all religious traditions often seem uncomfortably strange to modern readers. Having said that, I'll go ahead and read this story, which at-Tabrizi tells us was transmitted by the sixth Imam, Ja'far as-Sadiq, who in turn said that he had heard the story from the previous Imams. And so in this account, Ja'far as-Sadiq had said, and I quote, "The Messenger of God used to profusely kiss the mouth of Fatima, the queen of the women of the world, to the extent that Aisha said, 'O Prophet of God, I see you continuously kiss the mouth of Fatima and put your tongue into her mouth.' The Prophet responded, 'Yes, Aisha, for when I was taken into heaven, Gabriel brought me to the tuba tree and gave me an apple from it. I consumed it, and sperm formed in my loins. When I came down to earth, I had intercourse with Khadija, and she became pregnant with Fatima. Whenever I long for heaven, I kiss her and put my tongue into her mouth, for through her I encounter the breeze of heaven, and through her I encounter the scent of the tuba tree, for she is a heavenly human, in Siya Samawiya." End quote. Now, this passage raises many questions, and the part of the story most striking to modern readers is usually the description of the father-daughter kiss, which may sound disturbingly sexualized or at best bizarre. I would like to preface my reflections on this passage by simply clarifying that the passage was not intended to convey a sexual nor incestuous relationship. Physical displays of affection differ across time and culture, and even more so do the conventions of religious discourse and hagiography. What may seem quite reasonable to one people of one time and place may seem absurd to another. In this case, the Shi'i biographies were drawing upon the conventions of their time to imbue their story with meaning, and this process of making a meaningful story is precisely where I want to point our attention. We could also make a prefatory note about the question of historical accuracy. Here again, there is a gap between our own conceptions of what a biography ought to be and the driving concerns behind these narratives. As my study of these biographies has progressed, I've become more and more convinced that their authors were not primarily motivated by the desire to relate the most literal historical reading of events. Instead, they were engaged in the act of narrative building. In the case of the odd-sounding reference to the use of the prophet's tongue, we could do well to note the exchange of saliva is an ancient and widely used motif, one that often signified the transmission of knowledge from one spiritual master to another. Stories in this vein can be found in Christian, Sufi, Sunni religious texts. For example, some early Christian teachers, such as St. Augustine, believed that Jesus transmitted the Holy Spirit to his disciples through a mouth-to-mouth kiss. And Lala Arish, a Sufi saint of Marrakesh, is said to have conveyed mystical knowledge to her disciples through the saliva that she left on a shared piece of bread. This story itself echoes some early Sunni Sirah material about the prophet as well. Moreover, in Shi'i biographies often contain similar stories of a tongue-to-mouth exchange of saliva from father to son among the imams themselves, which further supports a non-sexual reading of this encounter with Fatima. With both the surprising elements and the mundane elements of the narratives that I read, I don't make any attempt myself to try to determine the historical accuracy of many of the stories that appear. Ultimately, there is little means to answer with confidence whether a story actually happened. And focusing on that question, I believe, significantly distracts from the main concerns of the authors and distracts from the impact of the literature. Instead, I grapple with questions that I believe are more important and compelling. Questions like, why is this story told at all? What does the narrative say about Fatima and about the relationship between Muhammad and Fatima? Are there practical implications to this story? And if so, for whom? And finally, what is the significance of Aisha's role in this account? Let me begin my exploration of those questions with some general comments about Fatima az-Zahra. Many of you are likely familiar that are aware that Fatima is the most highly revered woman in Twelver Shi'i literature. This was often asserted explicitly through titles such as the one that was in the passage I just read, where she is called Sayyid al-Nasa al-Alamin, Queen of the Women of the Worlds. She is commonly described as a heavenly being and elevated higher than any other woman in Shi'i circles. That is not to say that she was the only woman who was highly praised. As Denise Spellberg has nicely written about in her book on the legacy of Aisha, many Sunni and Shi'i scholars of the medieval period discussed and debated the relative merits of the honored women of their traditions. The four women most frequently grouped together in Shi'i literature are Asiya, wife of Pharaoh, Mary, mother of Jesus, Khadija, the first wife of the Prophet, and Fatima, his daughter. But this list is also not exhaustive, and the biographies of the imams that I read contain reverent mention of many women. Some of the names of those women, such as Zainab bint Ali, are quite familiar to us. Other names are rather obscure. In most cases, the women praised in these works are related to the imams by blood. They are the imams' daughters or mothers. The wives of the imams, however, aren't nearly as likely to be objects of reverence. Only those wives who become mother to the next imam are likely to be praised by the biographers. Other wives are usually remembered in a negative light. Moreover, the wives who are condemned generally appear as barren. One of the unique aspects of Fatima's life, of course, is that she embodied three roles with connection to the Prophet and imams, as daughter, wife, and as mother. This trifecta facilitated the use of Fatima as a key character in the literature I'm discussing today. In fact, nearly all of the biographies of the imams also contain a biography of Fatima. As the genre of collective biographies of the imams developed, it quickly became standard to begin with a biography of Muhammad and Fatima before proceeding to the accounts of the imams. This group of 14, often referred to as the 14 infallibles, would be an all-male club were it not for the presence of Fatima, and her inclusion in that group meant that she was praised in many of the same ways that her male counterparts were. The biographers accorded her a similarly exceptional birth, a beautiful body, a martyr's death, and like the imams, there are miracles connected to her life. We are even told that she had a sacred book, usually referred to as her mushaf, containing statements spoken to her by the angel Gabriel. Nevertheless, despite the ways in which Fatima was placed on par with the imams, both functionally and as an object of devotion, she was never presented by the biographers as an imam. Her female body stood between her and the institution of the imamate. Because Fatima's anatomy was seen as a definitive difference between her and the imams, it should come as no surprise to us that many of the narratives about her focus on her body. The biographer's attention to Fatima's physical attributes and feminine bodily functions is perhaps most obvious in stories of the miracles attributed to Fatima. The most well-known and frequently noted miracle of Fatima is that she did not menstruate. This monthly affliction, as it's often called in medieval sources, did not afflict Fatima. She was untainted by the fluid and blood which was viewed as an impurity. She was even said to have experienced no bleeding during childbirth. Moreover, the sources frequently refer to Fatima as the Virgin, a Batul, a designation likely to confuse some readers given that she was Ali's wife and mother of multiple children. The designation, however, was connected to the claim that she did not menstruate. In one account, the prophet was asked how Fatima could be considered a Batul, and he responded that a Batul is someone who never sees red blood, that is, she does not menstruate, end quote. Fatima's freedom from the taint of blood has a purifying effect on the fruit of her womb, and by extension, her followers. Considering her a virgin may also have been a way to bolster her status as the greatest of women because it kept her purity from being eclipsed by that of the mother of Jesus, Mary, whose virginity was widely accepted. This connection between the purity of Fatima's body and that of her offspring is made most explicit, however, in a phrase that's repeated across the biographies in the Shia tradition. Inna Fatima ahsanat farjaha faharrama Allah dhurriyataha ala nar. Fatima kept her genitals chaste, so God has protected her progeny from the fire. Neither this statement nor the reference to her as virgin are assertions that she did not have sexual intercourse. Instead, they are meant to emphasize the fact that she refrained from illicit or impure sexual activity, and that the miraculous properties of her reproductive organs and her own commitment to purity safeguarded the fate of her offspring. Through her female body, Fatima secured the sanctification of herself, her children, and implicitly all of the Shia. Her body had power. What becomes clear in a general overview of Fatima's portrayal is that she fell into a distinct ontological category, separate from woman, man, or imam. She embodied a feminine ideal completely unattainable by real women, whose essence is not derived from heavenly fruits, women who menstruate, who bleed at childbirth, and to whom angels do not speak. Fatima transcended the category of woman. She is not entirely unique in this position. Other daughters of the imams are described in similar ways, though with much less detail, as are women like Khadija and Mary. These super women, of whom Fatima is considered the best, stand in a category of their own. Their gender prevented them from being categorized as prophets or imams, but they were not normal women either. Having spoken more broadly about the portrayal of Fatima, let's return to this kissing story. This story speaks of Fatima's exceptional qualities and spiritual origins, but it also emphasizes the intimacy of her relationship with the prophet. Although there is very good reason to insist on a non-sexual reading of this encounter, we should not overlook the deep level of intimacy that is depicted. Aisha does not ask the prophet why he kissed Fatima, but why he's kissing her so much. Other accounts also contain vivid images of the physical affection displayed by the prophet toward his daughter. Imam Sadiq, the sixth imam, is recorded as saying that the prophet would not go to sleep until he kissed the side of Fatima's face and put his face on her chest and prayed for her. These stories continually bolster conceptions of Fatima's heavenly nature and the profound connection between her and her father. Other narratives record Muhammad as saying that Muhammad was part of him. or tell us that Fatima was the mother of her father, Abiha. In yet another account, the prophet describes his family in metaphorical language, saying, quote, I am the tree, Fatima is its branches, Ali is its seed, and Hassan and Hussein are its fruit, end quote. The combined effect of these narratives is to strengthen the connection between Muhammad, Fatima, and the imams to an extent that it becomes an unassailable, intuitive truth. This truth functions as the ground from which the ordering of meaningful narratives emerge. There's one other aspect of Fatima's portrayal in the biographies which establishes her physical and spiritual connections with the prophet. Although absent from this particular story that I read, that I'm focusing on today, Fatima often plays the role of mourner. If we had more time, we could look at the many examples of where Fatima acts as a eulogist for her father and other members of her family. Indeed, even though she is said to have died mere months after her father, she frequently appears in the literature as a mourner of Ali and her children and her grandchildren, whose deaths she is said to have foreseen or been informed about by an angel. The significance of her eulogies can hardly be overstated. Eulogies are generally the driving emotional force of many of the biographies. These poems of mourning attributed to her and others typically contain several recurring elements: praise for the prophet, indictment against those who have betrayed him, expression of extreme grief over that affair, and a vow never to forget him or to cease mourning. Her example beckoned an audience to join her in mourning, in an eternal remembrance. Thus, Fatima is a double point of connection. Her body connects the prophet with the imams, but she also assists an audience seeking to make their own connection to the holy, infallible men. This brings us to another question. Who was the audience for these stories? And what relevance did these stories have for their lives? These considerations further our understanding of the classical biographies, and recently such scholars as Jonathan Berkey have argued that the division between popular and scholarly discourses in medieval Muslim contexts was not always as clear as people had once presumed. These biographies that I'm speaking of followed many of the scholarly conventions of their time, but they were also arranged in ways that facilitated storytelling and popular preaching. In fact, many of the accounts in these biographies are also found in the collections of sermons and lectures of other Shi'i scholars. From the standpoint of gender, we might be tempted to think that the stories of Fatima and other praiseworthy women were geared towards female audiences, particularly given the fact that these stories have often been used in modern periods to support various conceptions of the proper roles of women. Fatima's legacy has indeed been invoked by many contemporary Shi'i women and men to legitimate certain forms of female religious authority. Such modern uses of her legacy should not lead us to assume that the original authors had in mind a female audience for their stories. Circling back to the observation that the stories about Fatima created an intimate link between the prophet and imams, we can add to that she modeled an intense love for these men. The love and devotion that she displayed is the key, I believe, to understanding why these stories were written and what purpose they served. Loving the imams is something incumbent on the Shi'i community. Sheikh Mufid records the fourth imam saying, quote, "Love us, for it is the love for Islam. May your love never cease, even if it becomes a public disgrace," end quote. Such exhortations are a regular feature of the biographies, and their omnipresence may have contributed to them being taken for granted by some modern scholars. But taking these instructions seriously helps us see that the love displayed by Fatima and other figures as well for the imams reveals a commitment regarding how the Shi'i community should enact devotion. A frequently told story about Jabir al-Ansari, for instance, one of the famed companions of the Prophet, tells us that he was taken as an old man to see the young fifth imam, al-Baqir, and upon seeing him, Jabir showered his affection on the young man, kissing his head, his hands, and his feet. Jabir explained his actions by saying that he was conveying the greetings on behalf of the Prophet. And here again we see an individual who functions as a link between the Prophet and the imams while simultaneously expressing his own devotion. Sheikh Mufid, in one of his lectures to his students, went so far as to call love for the imams one of the pillars of Islam. And At-Tabrizi records the Prophet saying, quote, "God loves whoever loves a Hussein." I've become convinced that one of the primary objectives of this literature was to cultivate this love for the imams within the community charged with preserving their legacy. Fatima's role in this is critical. Her position as daughter and mother served as conduits that channeled expressions of love for the Prophet and imams. Familial relationships add elements of naturalness and legitimacy to profound demonstrations of devotion. The concern driving these narratives is not how a woman ought to love her father or children. Rather, the stories give us a blueprint for what a proper devotional perspective towards the imams looks like. The narratives, I believe, shape male piety. Fatima empowers men to express their affection for the 13 perfect men around her. Suddenly, we start to have a better picture of the community for whom these texts were assembled. It was a community united by a shared piety whose foundation was love for the 12 imams. Cultivation for that love was a community-building activity. And its focus on a specific group of the Prophet's descendants formed a coherent us. Identity was being defined and asserted. We are the people who love this family. But to have an us, you must also have a them, the other. If an emotional tie to the imams was a defining feature of the community, the flip side of that is that those who were on the outside were defined by their failure to love the Prophet and imams. This brings us once again back to the kissing story. As we have seen, the person who observed this affectionate and perhaps even mystical exchange between the Prophet and Fatima was none other than Aisha. As most of you know, Aisha was closely associated with the opponents of Ali, and in classical Shi'i literature, she often functions as a foil for Fatima. The biographies I studied do not explicitly malign Aisha, but the combined effect of many of the stories in which she appears does cast her in a decidedly negative light. From a Shi'i perspective, something went disastrously wrong in the years and decades following the Prophet's death. And the stories about the imams were assembled in ways that help make sense of that memory. Just as Fatima served as a representation of the reciprocal love between the Prophet and his family, so too Aisha served a useful purpose in the larger Shi'i narrative. As I mentioned earlier, Shi'i biographies uniformly praise the imams' mothers and daughters. It's not always the case when it comes to their wives. This tendency may reflect a set of gendered values that the biographies enforce. Praises of women are based almost exclusively on their connection to the imams, which highlights a certain androcentrism to the biographer's conception of human destiny. Fatima's female body was elevated insofar as it served to reinforce notions of purity of her male descendants. But her sexual organs were sanitized in the process. The gendered values at work in the stories about her become even more clear when we look at stories of some of the wives of the imams. The imams' wives were tied to their husbands physically, emotionally, legally, religiously. But these marital bonds, unlike the blood ties between imams and their mothers and daughters, were not enough to secure them a favorable legacy within the biographies. The marriage relationship appears to be critically different from blood relationship, and not simply in regards to legal issues of rights and inheritances. At a conceptual level, marriage does not necessarily indicate inclusion in the divine or chosen family, or the Ahlul Bayt. A wife remained an outsider until she became the mother of an imam's child. Through childbirth, the wife was redeemed, at least in terms of the portrayal of these wives in the literature. Tellingly, only the wives or concubines of the imams who bear them children are even named in the biographies. The rest were simply forgotten. The only exception to this rule that I've been able to find are those wives who murdered their husbands. And with striking consistency, those murderous wives did not bear children for the imams. The spiritual distancing between the man from the marital bond went hand in hand with criticism of some of the prophet's wives, most notably Aisha, and it allowed certain wives of the imams to be blamed for treacherous and even murderous acts. Expressions of blame emphasized the wicked wives' sexuality and their physical bonds with their husband. The sexuality of Fatima and other holy women was downplayed and sanitized, while the sexuality of the deceptive wives was amplified. The biographers of the imams inherited and built upon, as I've said, an array of known literary motifs found in late antique and early medieval storytelling. Tropes of the deceitful wife, of the jealous wife, or at times killer wife, were ubiquitous in Near Eastern literatures of the period. In the case of the imams, at least two of them, though sometimes more, are said to have been killed by their wives. The Shia are in nearly universal agreement that Imam Hassan and Imam Jawad were poisoned by their wives. Without stating the comparison explicitly, I think this helps illuminate the general view of Aisha in this literature. The deceptive wives of the imams are physically close to their husbands, and their acts of betrayal are often attributed to their jealousy towards other women. Betrayal by a family member was a recurring theme within the biographies of the imams, one that helps us make sense of the events after the prophet and provides a mechanism for coping with the reality that the imams never assumed their rightful places as heads of the broader Muslim community. Just as Fatima represented the appropriate love and affection for the prophet and imams, Aisha served to symbolize the community that had betrayed that love. It's not an accident that Aisha is at the center of this narrative in the kissing story that at-Tabrizi presented. Her question to the prophet gives us the sense that she objected to the attention paid to Fatima. It's not explicitly stated that she was jealous, but that suggestion hangs in the air. Her question does more than provide the prophet with an opportunity to wax eloquently on the subject of his daughter's importance. When these biographies were written, Fatima and Aisha were increasingly portrayed as symbols of the Shia and Sunni communities. Minute details in the biographies were often part of discursive sectarian battles. In the case of this story, of saliva between the prophet and Fatima, this may have been a response to a popular narrative in Sunni circles in which the prophet and Aisha were also said to have shared saliva. Ibn Ishaq's narrative of the prophet's death, for example, says that Aisha softened the end of a sawak by chewing on it before she placed it into the prophet's mouth. Was this kissing story partly in counter to that moment of intimacy between Aisha and Muhammad? I don't know that we can say for certain, but if there is any doubt that these broader narratives were in conversation with each other, consider the account of Muhammad's deathbed found in most Shi'i sources that I read. For example, Sheikh Mufid's version tells us that the Prophet was on his deathbed and he feebly asked those present to send for his brother and companion. Aisha was there and she claimed that he must have meant Abu Bakr, and she sent for him. But when he approached, the Prophet turned his head and repeated the original request. Hafsa, another wife of the Prophet, interjected that he must have meant to call her father Umar. But again, when Umar was summoned, the Prophet turned his head away, saying that he wanted his brother and companion. Finally, Salama spoke up, saying that the Prophet meant Ali. And when Ali was summoned, the Prophet spoke privately with him for a long time. Ali remained there until Muhammad died. At the Prophet's request, he died with his head in Ali's lap. And as Muhammad's spirit departed from him, Ali wipes his face. The last point stands in stark contrast to mainstream Sunni narratives, which generally claim that the Prophet died with his head in Aisha's lap. In the biographies of the imams, Aisha's presence continually reminds the audience how things have gone wrong. In the accounts, for example, of the burial of Hassan, Hussein attempted to fulfill his brother's dying wish of being buried next to the Prophet. But in this story, in the Shi'i sources, Aisha literally stood in the way and did not allow him to be buried there, thus using her body to prevent a connection between the Prophet and Imam. Where Fatima united the family, Aisha divided it. The difference between Fatima and Aisha becomes a microcosm of the Sunni-Shia division. It adds definition to the line between us and them. The audience was part of this equation. The texts were not recorded in a vacuum, unattached from the concerns of a real community. In the passage I quoted earlier, where the Prophet compared himself and his family to the tree with its branches, that quote went on to say, quote, "Our Shia are the leaves of that tree. The tree whose roots are in paradise also has its branches, fruit, and leaves in paradise," end quote. So the religious vision that's cultivated through the biographies was one centered on the love of the Prophet's family, and it defined the community and was believed to dictate one's eternal fate. As I bring this to a close, I do want to make clear that it is not my intention to overemphasize Sunni-Shia differences. The biographers whose works I have examined were certainly engaged in the process of defining the boundaries of a religious community, but they were driven by many other concerns as well. They sought to strengthen the piety of their fellow believers and to provide a religious narrative that would inspire and provide guidance. Moreover, the stories about Fatima have implications on many issues beyond those I have mentioned. Karen Ruffle just recently wrote a nice article about how the portrayal of Fatima functioned as an engagement with theology and memories of Eve. I do hope, however, that I have highlighted the importance of how the stories of the Shi'i imams were arranged and remembered. The significance of these stories lies not simply in their interpretation of those major signpost events of early Islam, but in how a broadly meaningful and relevant narrative framed the events. Contemporary scholars may be tempted to gloss over some of the odd and potentially controversial narratives like the one explored today, or even worse, some might be tempted to take the story out of context and exploit its stranger aspects for their own purposes. Stories like the one I've talked about today tell us very, very little about the historical Fatima, Muhammad, or Aisha. They do, however, reveal a great deal about how the memories of these individuals dovetailed with the concerns of a particular community and how gender played a role in the discursive logic used therein. These stories did something for the community, and the relationship between the particular memories and the needs of the community who preserved those memories ought not to be neglected. Sunni narratives performed a similar function, and a full discussion of how Sunni and Shia parted ways would have to look at how each side has constructed its religious history. But for the Shia of the classical era, the memory of an Aisha who was jealously questioning the Prophet's affection toward Fatima served to reaffirm a community's commitment and loyalty to the imams. Fatima's love and love for Fatima affirmed the spiritual blessing of the imams. These biographies then reveal a Twelver Shi'ism that was moving away from revolutionary expectations and asserting a religious identity with an eye toward long-term survival. Thank you.